Master slide. It's not perfect. Ah, yeah. See, it's the imperfect of perfect, and therefore it's imperfect balance. It's the what do they call it in Japan? Wabu sabu something? Anyway, I'm just wabi sabi. No, that sounds like sushi. That's no way you're right. I might as well start. So again, this is a backup talk. There's no Perl on this. If you're into talks that are like, that's interesting, this talk is for you. When I'm talking about simulations, I'm talking about wearing goggles, having an arm behind your back, noise in your ear, stuffed ears, just also all sorts of ways in which people try to approximate the lived experience of somebody else. So, I'm Joop Vrachtenberg. I used to do Perl, not anymore. I just do anything right now because I'm a freelancer. I'm Dead Knight on Twitter, and since I used to work in accessibility and still sort of do, I run the Inclusive Design Accessibility Meetup back home in the Netherlands. And at some point we had a speaker who presented his experience partaking in a so-called Blind for a Day simulation. And this was started by a non-profit, and they kind of want to create awareness for people with disabilities, particularly people who are visually impaired. So what he did, he wore these darkened goggles and he just kind of walked around all day, walked his dog, got groceries, went to the toilet, just normal average daily tasks. And he spoke about how it made him feel, and he was just tired and drained and ready to just break down and cry at the end of the day. He felt awful, never do it again. And that was kind of interesting to me. So eventually that same nonprofit approached my meetup group asking, hey, would you like to promote our Blind for a Day challenge this year? So I approached my co-organizer and I said, I don't think we should do this. And she said, no, I've been to a big accessibility conference and I went to this talk about simulations, and they basically said, don't do disability simulations, they're a bad idea. And I figured, well, if people wanted to know what it's like to have a disability, just buy a person with a disability a beer and they'll talk to you about it. Because they do walk among you. So, or they don't walk, depending. But, so I felt strong about this. If you feel strongly about something, you tweet about it. So I tweeted something and I said, small rant, empathy exercises are the wrong approach to building things accessibly. It's not the right motivator. You should just do this because it's the right thing to do. If you want to know what it's like to have a disability, talk to somebody with that disability. Then I thought, well, that's kind of an opinion I hold. It's kind of like the Big Lebowski meme, this is just my opinion. Is that true? So I started to look, are there studies on this? Turns out there's loads of studies. So I started to read all these studies on sociology and psychology, and I want to talk to you about which scientific studies have been done. First off, I found a very interesting paper about, okay, what is a good simulation anyway? And this person is a doctor, and this simulation was about how do you treat a patient. So it's this very advanced dummy, and you can use it to measure heart rate or do CPR or try giving an injection. And it's a sophisticated mannequin, but it works well for the overall idea. And what he writes in his paper is you need, for a simulation to work well, you need an overall plausible interaction, good responses, good realistic equipment. You need a good attempt at mimicking reality, because if you mimic reality, it becomes a convincing story. And if you're in a convincing story, you're going to pay attention. You're going to be right in that story. Iron Man isn't really Iron Man, but you believe it because if anyone told you, hey, that's just a movie, right? You're going to tell them to shut up because you're watching the story and you're fully invested in that. And you have the entire suspension of disbelief. So that's what you want if you want to run a good simulation. You want to mimic reality at that level. There's a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, and he said that our minds aren't logic processors, we're way more story processors. We're very strange, emotional, crazy little primates. So, he said reality is truly a matter of perception. A fundamental assumption of simulation is that learning is enhanced when the environment seems realistic. Now, learning being enhanced is important, but before I get to that, I want to define a few more terms. There's a paper by Walter Kutu, Role-Playing versus Role-Taking, an appeal for clarification. He says, usually when we hear role-playing, what we actually hear, what the people mean is role-taking. So there's three concepts. There's playing the role. Right now I'm playing the role of a conference speaker. You give me that role as my audience. In sociology, there's often not really the idea of the self. There's more of a role that somebody plays, an agent plays. So right now, I'm playing the role of a conference speaker. You are playing the role as my audience. I could take a different role. Role taking, that's psychological. So playing a role is much more sociological. Taking a role is psychological. If I could take the role, for instance, of pretending I'm an attendee, which I would do while I was working on this talk, I'd imagine what would it be like if I was listening to this talk. What would I want to hear? And there's playing a role, taking a role, and there's playing at a role, which is like a child playing a cop at Halloween. The child can't really be a police officer. We won't give them that role. You're just playing around. So those are kind of the three ideas. So usually when we hear role playing, we actually mean role taking, which is that you pretend to be something you are otherwise not. Then we come to a simulation. So in the end, the simulation is an attempt to mimic reality in such a way that it convinces on the sociological, how are you perceived, and the psychological, how do you perceive yourself levels. In a really good simulation, you even suspend your own ideas of what you are and what you believe in, because that helps you learn. So for instance, I am not a psychologist or sociologist, but I am a volunteer firefighter. I've been one for 10 years. We train every week, and afterwards we say, okay, guys, see you at the big one. This was the big one. This was in a town next to mine. This took about a full day to put out. And for these things, you need to know what you're doing. You need to just handle. You need to act. You need to be well trained. So we use simulations to train ourselves for these sorts of scenarios. For instance, we wear these goggles, these straps, these covers around our helmets. And these are useful to use blind navigation, because you can still sort of see light, but you have to navigate by feeling. Or we can play that you have to hear where the leaky gas bottle is and navigate the building. So it's a very limited simulation, only gets you so far. Then there are smoke-filled rooms, which are kind of like this. This becomes more realistic. It's basically a bunch of Darth Vaders bumping into stuff. So it gets more realistic because you can use your flashlight to read the smoke. Is it pumping? Is it pushing? Is there something behind this door? And it becomes just a bit more realistic than just wearing the helmet cover. You can use real gas and wood fires, so you get the actual heat. You need to be even more careful. Real wood fires just, it gets really, really nastily hot. You can feel the heat. You can use water. You can train more effectively. The absolute best way is to use actors. I like to call them professional victims. So I've worked with good actors, and they will make you believe that they're in terrible, terrible peril, and you're the only person who can save them. And at that point, the simulation becomes such a good way to do things. So maybe that sort of learning tool could be the case for disability simulations. Because you want to improve, you want to measure, maybe you want to develop a product and you want to simulate whether it can be used by people who have a hand tremor or have a visual disability. You might want to train people, as I showed in the firefighting examples. And the training can pay off. Once we had Eric there, and Eric sits in a wheelchair. Eric has multiple sclerosis, and he got, with his powered wheelchair that he normally uses, he kind of rolled off a hill. Something went wrong, and he fell into the water, and he was in real danger of drowning. So we train with this. We train with these special suits. We train how to get somebody out of water quickly. And with that training, it really pays off at this point. Okay, so we might be able to use simulations to improve the way we develop and we train and we think about things. Well, why is that important? So I want to talk a bit about attitude. And attitude is defined as a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating a particular entity with some degree of favor or disfavor. Simply said, what is our emotive and our feeling towards this other thing? Do I like this? Do I dislike it? Am I afraid of it? Wary of it? Curious about it? Neutral towards it? All these things. How this reality currently portrays itself to me, and what do I think about that? Most of that is subconscious. You're not aware of that. I get into that later. But for instance, there's the idea of choice. Let's say you want to pick dinner. Oh, I'm going to pick that. You don't know why you pick that, not unless you really start to think about it. So this is a whole bunch of choices, and your attitude works on which choices you make. So this is a whole list of choices. You build into an array or into a pyramid, and you strip off the top one. That's what you do. Reality presents itself to you as a list of potential. You collapse the potential into your final choice. So you're in continuous feedback loop of transforming potential into action. So you're a self-modifying system, basically an applicative functor on top of reality. Now I've talked about programming, now we're cool. So it is possible, it can do that. There's a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. If that gets damaged through, let's say, cancer or an injury like Phineas Gage, where the rod shoot through his brain in an accident way back when. You can look it up, very interesting. He survived, but his ability to control his emotions and make solid choices was impaired. So they ran studies on this, very interesting book about it. And people who have damage there, they can build the list of potential. They can't make the choice. They don't know which one they must make. So they did gambling experiments on this one. People would just make the gambling choice that would negatively affect their winnings. And they wouldn't be able to make the cause and effect causal link all the time. And that also happens with people who are deprived from language from birth. So people are lost and they are found later. They've never learned language. They're also unable to see the causal link between cause and effect. So emotions and language really form the way we are as humans. We are such interesting creatures. Anyway, so you would think that emotion is really, really annoying, gets in the way, and Spock would just be really logically effective. Spock wouldn't get anything done because he wouldn't be able to build the optimal choice out of the list of potentials, because pure rationality doesn't do that. Your emotion drives your action. Klingons would make the solid choice right away. So there's a really interesting book about this, Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio. Here's the rod that went to the skull of Phineas Gage. And he's a neuroscientist. Very, very, very interesting book if you're into this sort of stuff. So what is a good example of one of these simulations that works on the psychological, how you perceive yourself, and the sociological, how others perceive you level? Another book. It's basically a big book sell, this talk. Black Like Me, 1969. This guy was a journalist, and he wanted to know what the Deep South was like for a black man. And he went to his doctor. He says, "Doctor, you have to make me black because I'm going to do this." His doctor says, "Don't do it, you're crazy." And he says, "I'm going to do it." So he put the stuff on his skin, and he took some stuff that colored his skin and was bad for his liver. And it's this thick a book. You can read it in an afternoon. And he did it. He went down there, but he also says, "I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself. There was another person looking back at me." That's how convincing it was. I'm not going to spoil the book. You must read it. If you haven't read it, it's absolutely amazing. This guy got death threats for that because he made it into a movie as well. But this was a really effective simulation because he was perceived by others as being not what he was. And he perceived himself by being someone else than he otherwise was. Also because how other people treated him. That reinforced the way he viewed himself. We are networks, and we act in these networks of people around us. Now I get to the studies, because one way to update the model of attitude is through involved simulation and role-taking, as we've seen. So there was a study, the influence of role-playing on opinion change. And they had a bunch of students, because that's what you do. You run a study, you bribe students with Snickers bars, and you give them stories that they have to debate in favor of, like people should eat more meat, for instance. And there was a group that would listen passively, and there was a group that would debate. And they found that the group that debated would favorably alter their ideas about the story they told. Because what you say influences what you think. So in a way, that's why lying and truth-telling fundamentally affects what reality is. Because if you tell a lie long enough, you're going to believe it. That's true, and these studies show that. That's just really interesting to show that emotional involvement is more effective as changing your attitude towards things or your beliefs than just passively listening to something. So another study did something similar about smoking. They said cigarette smokers had to convince other cigarette smokers to quit. And the cigarette smokers had to convince the others would also alter their own ideas about smoking and would decrease smoking. Again, the emotional involvement was more effective than the passive involvement. Another quote from that: role-playing resulted in greater mean positive attitude change than did simply listening. Active over passive. Another study, smoking again. 3 groups, a fear group. You have cancer. Here are the Röntgen photos, the x-rays. And this was presented by someone who dressed like a doctor in a real doctor's office. So again, realistic props, realistic interactions. A shame group, you're bad for being a smoker, you should stop. Not as effective. Cognitive group, debating, this is why you should quit. Not as effective. The emotional wall-taking procedure, sit down. You have cancer, here are the photos. We're going to start treatment, this is what it's going to look like, etc., etc. And somebody, who looks like a doctor, wears a stethoscope, as they do. And that was more effective. Again, follow-up study on the long-term effects of emotional role-playing. Used 12 college students, followed them for 18 months, and again found that emotional involvement was more effective than passive involvement in order to try to get them to stop smoking. So all these studies show the same thing. You can just listen to someone, but you need to be emotionally involved to really change your ideas about reality as far as you're concerned, your biases, your attitudes. Okay, so maybe we can use that to change the attitudes towards people with disabilities. And why would you want to do that? This is a really good book. It's called Stigma by Irving Goffman, who was a sociologist. And I'm going to kind of read a bunch of long quotes from that. He says that stigma is a process by which the reaction of others spoils normal identity, as far as we know what that is. I'm going to read a quote that uses some old terminology. We wouldn't use these words anymore nowadays, so please place them within context. I also learned that the cripple must be careful not to act differently from what people expect him to do. Above all, they expect the cripple to be crippled, to be disabled and helpless, to be inferior to themselves, and they will become suspicious and insecure if the cripple falls short of these expectations. It is rather strange, but the cripple has to play the part of the cripple, just as many women have to be what the men expect them to be, just women, and the Negroes often have to act like clowns in front of the superior white race, so that the white man shall not be frightened by his black brother. I once knew a dwarf who was a very pathetic example of this indeed. She was very small, about 4 feet tall. He was extremely well educated. In front of people, however, she was very careful not to be anything other than the dwarf. And she played the part of the fool with the same mocking laughter and the same quick, funny movements that have been the characteristics of fools ever since the royal courts of the Middle Ages. Only when she was among friends she could throw away her cap and bells and dare to be the woman she really was. Intelligent, sad, and very lonely. This, with some word changes, could have been written on a blog post within the disability community last week. Really very little was changed, which is quite sad. So maybe we can use studies to work, simulations to work on this. That's what Clore and Jeffrey thought. They were familiar with Goffman's work. Another thing Goffman says is that he found that people would raise their voice consistently to people they perceived to have a disability. And they figured, okay, what we'll do is we'll take a bunch of students, we'll put them in a wheelchair, we'll have 3 groups. One group uses a wheelchair to go to the cafeteria and get a drink. The other group follows them from a distance, just on foot. Third group goes somewhere totally different and also gets something from the cafeteria, and they can't say they're part of an experiment. So you have your control groups. And I want to read some quotes from this study from involved students in the wheelchairs. I am surprised what effects this has had on me. I was alone the entire time. I saw no one that I knew, so perhaps this made me take it all very seriously. All I know is that my eyes filled up with tears coming back up alone in that elevator. The looks that I received were very interesting and were consistently the same. People look out of the corner of their eyes and then a downward glance past my legs. They seem a bit embarrassed. My arms had started to bother me and it was hard to go in a straight line. When I got to the ramp at the Union, I started to go up and realized I was never going to make it. Now the study quotes these citations as evidence of the impact of the experience. But I don't think that's what we want, because the stigma is still here. There's this pity. There's not really like, oh, we want to fix the underlying problem, which is that it's hard to do things in a wheelchair around this campus. It's like, oh yeah, we feel bad. Now the students were more supportive afterwards of money being spent to improve things, even after a month and after 4 months, using this guy's telephone interviews, like, hey, by the way, we're running this questionnaire, how do you feel about disability affordances on campus? But there's still this strong exception of those people are in another group from us, and I don't think that that's the right approach. Another study, empathy and attitudes, can feeling from a member of a stigmatized group improve feelings towards the group. This was in the late 90s, and these people were familiar with the study by Clore and Jeffrey, the wheelchair study, and they wanted to know if you could also just use recordings to improve feelings towards the group that isn't yours. And could it be simply cognitive? Could we get rid of using emotion and use pure rational approaches? So they had these recordings of people who had a for instance, somebody who had AIDS and somebody who was living on the street, and they had two versions. So in one version, the person with AIDS had it because they were sexually promiscuous, and in the other one, they had AIDS because they had got a flawed blood transfusion. And the person was homeless. In one story, he'd been foolish with money, and in the other one, he just had bad luck. Basically, what's the responsibility of the person in this particular concept? One quote is that attitudes towards stigmatized people are notoriously hard to change. Why is that? Well, we are very good at pushing people into groups. We project all the time. We do this constantly. They said that only if the stereotype inconsistent information is widely dispersed throughout the group do we find these same things everywhere that don't match with our feeling about that group that we previously had. Are our biases sufficiently conflicted? Only then are we likely to change our stereotype. Again, we are really good at grouping and stereotyping others, because we should treat people as individuals, but that's not very easy, because then we're constantly really we're forcing ourselves to be really detailed about what each person is, and we just want to move on, and we don't have the time to really treat everybody as an individual, even though we should. Another study, cognitive process in the revision of stereotypical beliefs. Because if you want to actually change your stereotypical beliefs, how can you? So this study says there are three ways. There's the bookkeeping model, small Bayesian changes. So through observing reality, you make small adjustments to your conception of reality, and you use that to update your model. Okay. There's also the conversion model, big salient changes. You know, blind people use the internet. Oh, I didn't know that. Well, yeah, they do. And suddenly there's this thing you never knew, and it really warps your feeling of what is the world to me. Oh, it's now suddenly unknown. I don't want things to be unknown. That's chaos. I want to bring order back. Subtyping model, which is, well, here's a group of people like this, but this person is just a bit, this person is different, and I'm just going to subtype. Well, you're not like them. You're like this. So even though that same attribute goes maybe for the entire group, but it allows your idea of the world to not change too much, because that's painful, because then you have to readjust, you have to turn that chaos back into order, so you can turn the unknown into the known, and you don't want that because that takes cognitive effort. I get into that later. There's a very interesting book on changing your biases by cognitive psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and he writes about the rider and the elephant. This is part of our brain that's here, other part of our brain, and most of our choices are made by the elephant. And the elephant just kind of does its thing, and the rider tries to whip it into shape, and, you know, go there, and the elephant doesn't listen. It's like, you know, there's another book about this, Thinking Fast and Slow, because the fast and slow brain, system A, system B, and he talks about these he tried to identify these moral foundations, careness, fairness, for instance. It's why we react so strongly when we see people parking in a handicapped spot, and we don't think they should be parking there. We get very righteous about that, and he talks about that. Why are there these strong divisions on how people feel about each other? Particularly religion and politics, but it's otherwise a very interesting book. But yeah, we have to default to these biases, because if you're on the savannah, like, is that a tiger? Could be something else. Could eat me, could not eat me. Maybe it already ate. You don't have the time to think about that. You need to act. And 90% of what we do is already unconscious. Otherwise, we'd just be loading. You can't get anything done. So usually we take up to like 0.5 seconds to consciously make a decision. We're not earthworms. We're not sponges. We get loads of input, and we need to make sense out of all that input. Again, we take the potentiality of reality and we collapse it into what we end up doing. So lots of stereotyping behavior happens in our subconscious. And well, could we even change that then? Well, they ran a study on that. That's perceptive taking. So again, the psychological role taking, increase or decrease stereotyping. And they talk about cognitive closure. So we either project ourselves on another. They are like us. We do this on Twitter all the time, because 140 or 280 characters doesn't tell you much about somebody, so you're going to project yourself on them, or you're going to project a stereotype that you think applies to them on them. So, or you subtype them. But depending on your proclivity for cognitive closure, which is how open are you into changing your ideas about something, how more closed or how open you are on the psychological level, the more you're going to be able to change your biases around something else. I have to quickly cut to another study, because another study ran can we even know when we are biased? And they said, well, we're actually smarter than we think. So they run MRIs on students, and they gave them these logic problems. So say they measured particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and the right lateral prefrontal cortex, which have to deal with our way of how we perceive things. Now we map them into categories. They would say, okay, so here are 900 lawyers. Well, let's say we have 1,000 people, 900 are lawyers, and the rest is engineers. Okay, so here's Jack. Jack's 45. He's married with 4 kids. He doesn't like politics or social stuff, and he likes maths and puzzles. What is Jack? Come on, what's Jack? He's an engineer. Why? Why? Because he's like us. Okay, why? He's like, yeah, okay, that's a rational choice. Yeah, logically, he's a lawyer. Rationally, he's an engineer. If he cries a lot, he works in accessibility. But anyway, so again, we think emotionally or rationally, but we actually know when that happens because that part of our brain fires when we use stereotypical information. Our brain, our subconscious, is aware of when we use biased information, which makes sense because we need to update our model, but we're not aware of it, which otherwise we wouldn't get anything done, we'd just be spinning. Back to that study about cognitive closure. What they did is they had a bunch of students and they said, okay, look at this photo of an elderly. Now imagine a day in the life of that elderly person. We're going to roll take. Now, roll take as the elderly person by walking with a cane or feeling or something heavy or anyway. So we go from simply looking, passive, to thinking about it, what's a day in the life like, and then we actually simulate that day in the life. And they found that that people with a high proclivity for cognitive closure would actually they would increase their stereotype. Now, okay, clearly, I'm not going to change my mind. I actually managed to increase the way I feel biased towards this group, and people with higher openness would decrease. They would be more open to consider that their projection was not the lived experience of an old person. I got to go back to that recording study. Sorry, I skip around a bit, but it has a narrative. DS90 study ran the experiments with the audio, and they found that, like the results reported in the wheelchair study, are finding that an empathy-inducing listening perspective improved attitudes towards convicted murderers 1 to 2 weeks later suggests that the empathy attitude effect, can the study influence attitude, is not as short-lived as we had feared. It sticks around. Apparently it can outlive the empathic emotion itself, which basically means if we run a study, if we run a simulation, a real good simulation, it changes the attitude long term. Our emotion-based approach to attitude change, so not just cognitive, not just logical, not just Spock, emotion-based approach did not seem vulnerable to the subcategorization effects, which means you were less likely to say, oh yeah, but no, you're not like the others. They often play cognitive approaches such as collapsing that into what I found again. Again, this repeats, emotional involvement works better. Thinking about it is, if it works only long term and it's not as effective into actually changing your ideas. Because you're going to reason about it, oh yeah, but no, you need to be emotionally involved. Okay, so then I can just go right and simulate and fix the world. And Beatrice Wright would say, no, not so fast. She was a psychologist, and she worked a lot on, I can't think of the term, rehabilitation psychology. It's on the slide. And she said she considered this misguided role-playing. She said, my concern is that role-playing can enhance not only the understanding of some problems, but also pervasive pity and devaluation, which we saw in the wheelchair study. Like, oh, these people have just said, oh, if I had a disability, oh, I wouldn't, oh, so terrible, oh, awful. Actually, feelings of inferiority, lack of confidence, and helplessness hardly need role-playing, for these are common stereotypes of people with disabilities held by the outsider. She's warning about the boomerang effect, which is you're more likely to actually make the problem worse because now people hadn't really thought about what it was like to have a disability, and now they actually sort of approached it, and they feel worse about it. How long do I have? 15 minutes. Oh, thank you. She argues for constructively guided role-playing, which is more like long-term, be dependent on each other, feed each other. And apply for a job where you would apply for a job. I would say, you have you act like you have multiple sclerosis. That's your story. And I said, no, I'm not going to hire you. And then we switch places. So we both feel that you're dependent on something else or somebody else, and that you judge somebody else. She says it's way more involved. It's guided. It tells you already why the simulation is there. It's not secretly a simulation to gauge attitudes towards people with disabilities. There was also a study that influenced a bunch of architects and city planners, and they had to use the city they planned and the buildings they planned in a wheelchair. And they actually said that they had discovered the problems of unramped curbs, steps, unadapted toilets, and restrictive fire regulations. So in that sense, really that involved constrictively guided role-playing can be very effective. This is Mike Holmes. Who knows who Mike Holmes is? No, okay. In Canada, he's a national treasure. He says do it right the first time. If you had a shitty home improvement guy and he screwed it up, he comes and he fixes it. And he says, oh, they did this wrong and they did that wrong. And he says, you should just build the code. You should do it right the first time. Which, yeah, we should know we should know that we have to write tests and write documentation. We know how to build the code. But I also think that it's a good thing to know why you are doing things. So if you are a city planner and you have to explore it in a different mode than you normally do, you get a better idea of why do I do these things? Why do I write tests? Why do I write documentation? Why do I have curb cuts? There was another, she talks about assertive role-playing and role reversal. I already talked about that. Another person said, no, I am going to study disability simulations. And I'm already going to assume that they're bad, and I'm going to see if I can confirm my hypothesis. And they had 2 experiments. They would simulate blindness, and they would simulate an amputee where you had one arm behind your back and you had to feed yourself, stuff like that. And then they would record it, and other people would passively watch the recordings. And again, they saw that the emotional involvement was more effective than just passively watching somebody else struggle with a disability, whether real or not. Another similar study about that. Disability simulations, logical, methodological, that's a fun word, and ethical issues by Gary Kiger. He's a sociologist. Similar opinion. He says it's really hard to create good simulations, but it can be done and it can be used for positive results. He says there's not a lot of research in this that's long term and not enough psychosocial research, and you have the risk of the boomerang effect that you're actually making the problem worse. But if you do it right and you do it carefully, it can be done. He says what we want to change are not people's attitudes, but their behaviors. That's key. Will a disability simulation change how participants interact with persons with disabilities in the future? That is the central question. It's a difficult problem to address. So, additionally, going on a blind walk for an hour does not give a participant the feel for experiences of discrimination, rejection, or pity that might be directed towards someone who is visually impaired. That's true. It's only an approximation. You have no idea what it's like. It's like using a screen reader for a day to experience, what is it like to browse the web like somebody who is blind. But you only have a part of it. You don't have the full experience. It's very limited. But they can be used on long-term studies, perhaps. Crip for a day, talk about a loaded title. The unintended negative consequences of disability simulations. Good recent study. They wanted to confirm their hypothesis. The simulations were bad. And again, they found that empathy would be created. Like, oh, that's so awful, but also, and I never want to be like that, and it'd be the worst thing ever. Simulating disabilities promotes distress and fails to improve attitudes towards disabled people, undermining efforts to improve integration, even while participants report more empathetic concern and understanding of what the disability experience is like. So it actually makes things worse. So by that, I actually stop a little early and I come to my conclusion. So I found that, these things can be used, but you have to be really careful and you have to be clear from the beginning in what you do. So let's say I want to answer my own question. I would give all of you the ATPD test. It's a standardized form, the attitudes towards persons with disabilities. And I would say, okay, all of us are going to go outside in a wheelchair and we're going to go to Old Town and we're going to get some food and then we're going to come back here. Okay, now you come back here and I'd have you think about it like, hey, how about we write down 500 words about how we felt about it? Because then you rethink, what was it? Oh, I had trouble here. Oh, this person wouldn't even look at me. Oh, this was really strange. And then you actually would need to talk with actual people with that disability. So you have a dialogue, because they can say, it felt really bad at first, But you get used to it. I mean, what else are you going to do? You're going to just sit in your house and not do anything? No, you have to. It's perfectly able to, you can perfectly live with this disability. Yeah, it's not easy, but what is in life? So you kind of want to have that dialogue, because what you see in all these studies, people with disabilities aren't involved. It's all about us without us, which is not what you want. You want to get those people involved from the beginning. It's kind of strange that doesn't happen anywhere. So there is a philosopher of mind called Thomas Nagel, and he wrote a paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he says, we can't know. Even if we couldn't read a bat at like the neuron level, we still can know as humans what it's like to navigate by sonar. We don't know what that experience is like. It's fundamentally incompatible with us. And what Nagel also says is, well, it goes the same thing with the other mind. We can't fully know what the experience of somebody else is. We can't know. So there's this movie called Dances with Wolves. I'm kind of dating myself here. There's a movie called Avatar. And so at some point, the main character, Sully, what's his name? He tries to become like the Na'vi, like perfectly like Na'vi, but he can't because he's a person pretending to be real Na'vi. So in the second movie, it'll be interesting because he should have become full Na'vi, but how would that work with the compatibility of the human psyche? And it's a movie, but it's a good story, and that's why you take it seriously. It's an archetypal story, and that's why it works. If you want to read about archetypes and stories, very interesting book by Hero with 1,000 Faces, Joseph Campbell. Look it up, really cool stuff. But that's basically what I have. Like, if you want to do these things, you can, but be careful of the boomerang effect. Be clear in what you want to achieve, and involve people with disabilities. And I find it very interesting to talk about this to a bunch of Perl developers. So thank you all for coming, and yeah, have a great rest of the conference at Lightning Talks. Thank you.
That's also what I like in your meetup group, the inclusive design group, where you have these people with disabilities and a lot of people who work with websites.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really nice to have such a meetup group in Holland.
Yeah, we need to keep bringing people together, because only through emotional involvement and dialogue you're going to change each other's ideas about what constitutes the other. All right. Well, what's with the waving? Question. Okay.
Has there been any studies on the effect of legislation on people's attitudes towards disabled accessibility? I'm thinking about access to buildings.
Have there been studies on how people feel about that legislation, or how they?
Yeah, how people's attitudes have or have not changed.
Not that I know, but I haven't looked to be. I've particularly looked at disability simulations, and I mean the simulation showed that people's ideas towards that legislation became more favorable, at least on the university campus and their students, so they know about the world. But then, I would carefully think that it might work through simulations, but I don't know if you said, okay, we're going to add this new legislation because we should. That might be very different, because depending again on your proclivity for cognitive closure, you might dig your heels in and say, no, I'm not paying for that with my tax dollars, depending on what kind of openness you have on the psychological level. So I'd be interested to read about that, yeah, but not that I know of.
This is more an observation, so I don't know if the recording is really the two parts of this were, one of the conferences a while back, Karen came with a friend who was in a wheelchair, and it was a massive eye-opener, just trying to help her get around all the stupid of missing curve drop and so on. But then that made me aware later on, once pushing my children around in a pushchair, which didn't have a stigma of being in all of what you're saying, the boomerang, but every time with a pushchair I thought, this is a soul, I've got to pick the thing up. Made me think, well, if I were in a wheelchair, fatal problem. So it was interesting, just a pushchair was an interesting simulation of a wheelchair for the same set of problems.
Yeah, so you accompanied somebody with a constraint, and through that you were emotionally involved. You weren't just watching them do the thing. And yeah. So yeah. Again, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, the pushchair made an interesting wheelchair simulation.
Yes.
Without any.
And then it could go into, well, inclusive design helps everybody because curb cuts and ramps and yeah, but
Has there been any attempt to try and simulate
have there been attempts to simulate learning disabilities? That is very difficult. I think I recall there having been done with like just disruptions, like noise, so you can't concentrate. But I think otherwise you would have to use drugs, and that is ethically questionable. So yeah, and again, you run into the same problem. How can you know that you're simulating the lived experience of somebody with, and that's, yeah, I wouldn't. Sorry, Hammer, you want to say something? Okay. Right? Oh.
Disruptive sound experiment actually been done in real life, do you know? Because I recognize it as the technique that was used in the short story Harrison Bergeron to handicap people who were too intelligent.
Is that Kurt Vonnegut? Okay. I'm trying to remember now if I actually have that from Kurt Vonnegut. I'm not sure. I have to look it up. I don't know. I'm sorry. But thank you for reading that up, because I don't know where I got that. All right. I'm going to unplug.